A chill rushed up through the ruined city as Courtney stared out across the darkened landscape. Only a few days prior, Anwen had stood in that exact same spot as she waited to head out on her journey to find the other mages. But the blonde mage didn't know about that as she let her gaze wander to the different peaks. It had been a productive day. The first group of mock combatants had done well. At least no one had gotten seriously injured, though a few riders had fallen into the lake. The Amugi had rescued them before anything major could happen. Despite that, a few had developed some odd spots that itched like crazy. At least those that had been of short duration. Chances were good it was a dragon spell to help protect the waters. It was also possible it was a prank from the attacking party. Either way, no one had admitted to it. The second group had done better, having the opportunity to observe the fight before them. Most of them had thought to pay enough attention. As such, they'd actually gotten further along than the other group. To say they'd all felt exhausted afterwards would be a major understatement. And thankfully, Callum had called an end to the mock battles after the second run. Those mages paired with dragons went off in separate groups to get to know each other better. If they kept the same arrangement, it would be best for them to know and trust each other for the upcoming battle. Their lives would depend on it. All this preparation left Courtney wondering what to do about Callum. He'd been quite attentive while they were sparring. He had even condescended to return to mortal form to give her some decent practice. Despite that, she somehow doubted he was going to partner up with her when all the craziness hit the fan. But he didn't talk to her in quite the same snide way he had when she'd first been given the task as stand-in Kata. That was something, at least. Courtney leaned against the retaining wall and stared out over the city. What were Tyler, Anwen, and Walter doing at that moment, she wondered. Had they found the first clue? The second? Were they at that exact moment headed to the mage camp, or were they headed towards disappointment? Do the other mages still exist? She had no answers and it frustrated her. But at least the training was going well. The mages and dragons were starting to work together as teams. It helped to have Callum actually down there with her. She doubted she would have gotten this far without him, no matter how hard she tried. But she wasn't about to go and thank him for it. Chances were good he wouldn't accept any thanks she offered anyway.
"What troubles you, daughter?"
Kern asked as he strode out of the shadows in mortal form. His long robes trailed out behind him, looking gray and silver in the moonlight. The mage shook her head, not sure what to say.
"I'm probably just thinking too much,"
she answered.
"But I can't help but wonder how this is all going to work out. Today was a success, but what about tomorrow? And the day after? And what if Anwen and the others don't make it back in time?"
The aged dragon moved to stand by her side.
"Do not borrow tomorrow's trouble, for today has more than enough,"
he said with a hint of a smile.
"Many are too busy looking ahead to see the miracle of the here and now. The what-ifs and worries of the future will take care of themselves when the time comes."
Courtney couldn't help but look into the wizened face at his words.
"I wish I had the same kind of optimism you do,"
she admitted.
"but you've had hundreds of thousands of years to perfect that, haven't you?"
Kern chuckled at her question.
"I suppose I have. However, it is anyone's for the taking, if they so desire. It is all a matter of perspective,"
he added.
"I see the world as a series of possibilities. Some are beautiful beyond compare. Others are as bleak as the circumstances we now face. But it is what you choose to focus on that will determine the moment. Yes, we will soon be up against odds far outside our favor. But we fight for a better cause, and that is sometimes all it takes to make up the difference. For a cause that is just cannot fail so long as there are those who believe in it."
She looked at him, not sure she understood, though she wanted to, and it showed on her face.
"I guess what I need to do then is to believe in myself and those under my command,"
she hazarded. The dragon laughed again.
"It is a start,"
he agreed.
"All things have a time and a purpose, and all things must grow from some point or other. Not every seed becomes a tree or a flower, though what it may produce may be more valuable in the end. And where there is hope, darkness cannot reign for long.
He placed a hand on her shoulder before removing it as he turned away.
Do not dwell on the possibilities too much. Focus on the here and now. It will all come out right in the end, to whatever end that might be. It will be the right one.
His words faded as he moved from sight, leaving Courtney with even more to think about. Anwen looked out on the vast, empty space before them. Small shells crunched underfoot as she stepped out onto the salted ground. The dry lake lived up to its name, slowly beveled into a scooped mass of emptiness. The air seemed to shimmer with the heat as the sun moved across the sky. She could feel the moisture seeping from her skin as she stood there. To the left, a set of tall crags dominated the view, their darker browns and greens thrust up from the horizon. They looked like pencils dropped in the scattered heap of stone, but the sky seemed bluer in that direction as a result.
Looks inviting,
Walter commented as he shifted his feet. The small shells ground to silica powder underfoot. A slight breeze swept the fragments into the air.
Was there ever actually a lake here?
He couldn't help but think back to the night before and the events that had left them somewhat stranded for a while. The mental attack both Anwen and Tyler experienced had taken a lot out of them, and they'd slept like the dead. In fact, they'd slept through an entire day and into part of the next night. This left Walter with a lot of time on his hands to contemplate things, but once the two had woken up, they headed out once more. Thankfully, they'd reached the next town over a few hours past dawn. There, they'd managed to find another rental car to at least finish this leg of their journey. That, and they'd informed the other rental company of their previous car's defects and its location. Tyler looked over, the hint of smile on his lips.
Can't you tell? As if the shells weren't sign enough. Look at the salt crystals all over the ground.
He pointed.
This was once a salt lake, possibly connected to the ocean. That or this part of the continent was underwater for some time in the past. Take your pick. Either's possible.
Walter shook his head. He felt sure the Dragon Lord knew the truth on that matter, but it didn't tell them what they were supposed to do next. They'd made it this far, but now what?
Okay, so what about this whole thing about the next clue falling from the sky?
He countered. Anwen shook her head at the both of them.
It didn't say it would fall from the sky.
She corrected.
It said, near the dry lake will your next clue fall. Chances are good we won't even have to go searching down the salt flats.
Tyler began pacing, one hand to his chin in thought.
If we take it literally, it's near the lake, not in it, like you said.
He gave Anwen an appreciative glance.
But I doubt the rest is literal. Sometimes that term was used to say something like, it will be around here, more or less.
Find the crags tall.
Walter reminded.
You know, maybe it's in the area between the lake and those mountains.
He pointed to the peaks to the left of them. It made sense, but that still left a lot of area to cover. The Dragon Lord continued to pace back and forth.
Let's see. If I were a mage on the run, where would I put a clue so it's not too obvious, but also easy for whomever to find it?
He turned towards the craggy reaches between them and the northern coast.
Listen.
Margo's voice invaded Anwen's thoughts.
Walk towards the mountains and listen.
Anwen moved forward, heading towards the small range. She didn't give so much as a word of explanation as she moved off. Small shells crunched underfoot until she reached the edges of the dry lake.
What in the world? Where's she going?
Walter asked, but Tyler held him back with one hand. He watched as the young woman continued to move away from them. The Dragon Lord finally removed his hand so they could follow her from further back. When he tried to speak again, Tyler hushed him. Lakeda walked as though in a trance, her footsteps sure as she followed the edge of the waterline. The further she moved away from their starting point, the closer she got to the mountains. Low scrub began to thrust up from the ground. A few gnarled-looking evergreens broke up the area. They were all turning brown with thirst. About 5 minutes later, Anwen stopped near a tall pine. Unlike the others, it rose above the rest in the brilliant greens of health. She found a convenient boulder to sit on and settled down to wait.
What is she doing?
Walter whispered. only to be silenced by his companion once more. Tyler stared at Anwen's back.
Listening.
He answered after several seconds.
I think she has another idea on how we get the clue. So until she figures it out, we wait.
He found a clear spot on the ground and lowered himself down. Who knew how long they'd have to wait? A bird of prey cried out as it flew over the desolate salt plains. Its cry echoed from the crags, only to be dampened by the trees facing the small party of three. Several hours had passed since Anwen had parked herself in front of the giant pine, and she still sat as if waiting for something to happen. The sun slid across the sky, now heading down towards the western side of the continent. With only the trees for shade on one side, it was a tough choice. They could either sit in the heat or risk being tangled in the undergrowth. Some of the lower plants didn't look all that inviting. They had thorns and other briars growing close to knee level or lower. Walter shaded his eyes as he looked towards the sky, hoping for a cloud or something to pass between them and the sun. The salt from the dry lake didn't help, and even though he'd been careful about how much water he'd consumed from his canteen, it was starting to get low. Tyler, for his part, opted to sit on the ground next to Anwen's boulder. He tucked his legs underneath him, crisscross style, hands laying over his kneecaps. The Dragon Lord closed his eyes. It made him look like some kind of mountain guru, except he wasn't old or bony, nor was he wearing a robe. The veteran was about to speak when something changed. He couldn't immediately identify what. It took him a moment to realize that a sort of hush had filled the air around them. Everything seemed still, except for the one tall pine. It seemed to bow, pine needles rustling. Walter did a double take as the tree literally bent towards Anwen, almost as if bowed by a strong wind. Its highest branches scraped the ground behind them as it moved to surround them. If he didn't know any better, he'd be willing to bet the thing was enclosing them in a sort of cocoon of wood. The light dimmed drastically as the branches moved to create a sort of dome over and around them. The needles seemed almost woven together to form this woodland amphitheater. Then Anwen stood as gracefully as any dancer. Her hands reached up as if to accept something from the tree above them. Light seemed to radiate from the space between the kid's hands. A spear of similar radiance descended down from above to join with that light. Walter watched in a stunned silence as it seemed the world's most perfect moment. The light increased in brilliance as a sphere formed between Anwen's open palms. It spilled between her fingers, and then with a blink of an eye, it was over. Walter shook his head, not sure what his brain told him he'd just seen. The trees were back to normal. The breeze created small whistling sounds as it moved through the area. The sun beat down on his back just as steadily as it had only moments before. Had something really happened, he wondered? Or had he succumbed to heat stroke? But he knew something had when he looked towards Anwen. She was still standing, her hands held out in front of her as if cradling something precious.
Did you get it?
Tyler asked, startling Walter. It wasn't that his voice was loud, because it wasn't. It sounded almost reverent. It seemed that what the veteran thought he just witnessed had really happened, like it was some kind of spiritual experience that was seen, not with the eyes, but with the soul. Anwen turned towards the Dragon Lord and smiled.
Yes.
She replied as she let her hands fall back to her sides. They were empty. And she got a faraway look in her eyes as she began to recite.
In the forest you will find us. Between the eastern mountains and the sea, surrounded by ancient vegetation and far from any city.
There are 2 forests I can think of between the eastern mountains and the ocean.
Tyler mused.
There was the one that surrounds what was once the city of Mora. It's grown quite large, reclaiming anything inside its boundaries. Then there's the smaller one nestled by the southern foot of the eastern mountain range. I don't think it has a name, at least not any I can remember.
Walter could see it without taking out the ancient map, the city of Mora. It sat surrounded by trees on all but one small tract. If what Tyler had said was true, he'd bet his livelihood they'd find the lost mages there.
Well, Why don't we try this reclaimed city?
He suggested.
Sounds as likely a place as any, right?
Tyler nodded.
I'm sure we can get there by morning, if we only stop for necessities.
He glanced towards Anwen, who gave him a wry look.
Whoever isn't driving gets to sleep. Sound like a plan?
Anwen couldn't argue with that as they headed back to the lake's western edge.
I'm game.
She admitted as she looked towards Walter. Since Anwen didn't have a license to drive, it was up to Tyler and Walter. But she doubted anyone would mind if she took a turn. They had given her a crash course on the mechanics of driving, and since it was an automatic transmission, she felt somewhat comfortable with the idea of giving it a go. At least she figured she'd do a decent job of it if they'd let her.
We need to pick up a few supplies somewhere along the way. Tony Falls might be our best bet. Don't want to go there and find all the shops closed.
He gave a funny sort of chuckle as he led the way back to the car.